Okay, so the skeletal system. What we're going to do is we're going to go through gross anatomy, talk about bone tissue types, talk about basic bone categorization, and go into microscopic anatomy. All right, first and foremost, functions of the bones. The overall function of the bone is very straightforward. We have three anatomical functions, okay, support, protection, movement. So those are basically our anatomical functions of the bone. We look at this in terms of the anatomy and how it carries it out. Storage and removal, so the storage of calcium and phosphorus, hydroxyapatites, blood cell formation, those are mostly what we will consider physiological functions, so we'll talk about them in greater detail with the physiology stuff. Notice for support, internal framework, we support organs, anchor soft organs. If you go back and look at the picture of the cavity that shows you the parietal and visceral peritoneum, you can see how that cavity anchors and is held in place by how it attaches to the organs and the walls of different areas, especially the abdominal pelvic region. The same thing if you look within the thoracic region and look at how everything attaches to the area around the rib cage, the thoracic cage, etc. Okay? Protection of soft organs, obviously we have a skull protecting our brain, the vertebral column protecting our spinal cord, and the thoracic cage or the ribs protecting our heart and lungs. Movement, levers. You should remember from physical science, first, second, third degree levers. And we'll talk about those when we go into the appendicular system, or appendicular skeleton. All right, first and foremost, basic tissue types. Compact bone, homogeneous, reinforced concrete. Okay, one of the things to remember is when we talk connective tissue, we are talking about the connective tissue. We're talking about extracellular matrix. Okay, when we talked about bone, bone is a crystalline matrix. Okay, it's literally calcium phosphates. Here, we're just going to say crystalline. It's a crystalline matrix composed of calcium phosphates, and then we have collagen fibers that also occur there. The collagen within this crystalline matrix is what makes it reinforced concrete, because reinforced concrete is composed of rebar and cement. So think of the crystalline matrix as the cement, the rebar, the collagen is the rebar. So that's what makes it reinforced concrete. Now spongy bone is a little bit different. Spongy bone is literally like an internal scaffolding. So each of those small needle-like pieces play on each other and support each other and give a very strong structure. So when you look at this, you can see, by the way, it was mostly empty space, right? Honeycomb-like. You can see here lots of empty spaces. So I have, this is my spongy bone right here. So you can see all of this is spongy bone. Okay, I can see lots of empty spaces. I can see those little needle-like processes. And this area here, you can see how homogeneous looking this is. That's my compact bone. So see how smooth and everything. Typically when we think of bones, usually we think in terms of compact bone because that's the tissue we look at. Okay, that's what most bone tissue looks like. All right, now types of bones. We have four basic types of bones, and these are based on structural differences: flat, long, short, and irregular. Okay, long bone, very straightforward. Literally, it is longer. Whoops, got to make that a straight line, huh? It is longer than it is wide. So literally, that's all that makes it a long bone. You see long bones exclusively in the appendicular skeleton. The interesting thing about the long bone is what, when most people ask, well, what does a bone look like? A long bone is usually what most people will draw. This is the typical bone. Now, what makes a long bone extremely strong is that it has, and this is also what makes them usable, they have an internal cavity and they are predominantly compact bone in this shaft region. Okay, and we'll go into greater detail as we go through. Now, short bone. Short bone, literally that. Notice that they are roughly the same distance across as they are in height, width, however you want to look at it. They're cube shaped. Okay. Again, you can see that you find these in the tarsal region, the carpal region. We also see this within the patella. Now, the patella is what's known as this type. It's a special type of short bone known as a sesamoid bone. That's the patella. Okay. Lastly, we have flat bones, thin, flattened, typically curved. So these don't have as much bone as we associate with either short bones or long bones, but notice their strength. Their strength literally comes from that curve. Okay. That curve is what gives these bones their strength and allows them to be used for protection, because we see most of these in the axial skeleton, skull, ribs, sternum, okay? These are predominantly used for protection. Now, the scapula isn't. The scapula is movement, but again, for the most part, protection. Now, irregular, literally everything else. Whatever bone is not a curved bone, curved and flat, a cubish shaped bone, or a long bone, it's an irregular bone, okay? Now, structure. As we said, the long bone is what we consider the typical bone, so this is the typical structure. Key parts, diaphysis. Diaphysis is all we call the shaft. So that's this area here. That's this long, narrow portion of the bone. The medullary cavity is the hollow in the midst of the shaft, okay? Now, it contains yellow marrow in adults, red marrow in infants, and we'll go into greater detail about why yellow and red when we go into that in homeostasis and physiology. All right, the epiphysis is the end part here. And you can see that we have two heads, and we have what's known as a proximal epiphysis, and we have a distal epiphysis. And again, go back to that terminology. Distal means further from the point of attachment, proximal closer to the point of attachment. Notice also they are predominantly spongy bones. So where in the long bone and the diaphysis we have this cavity, here we have spongy bone. And this spongy bone, this gives it an internal scaffolding. It's the spongy bone within the epiphysis that makes the epiphysis so strong. It's like having that internal framework that helps hold it together. It's also covered in what's known as articular cartilage. Now, articular refers to a place where bones meet, articulations, joints. Okay, the articular cartilage protects the ends of the bones and actually creates a smooth surface that the bones can move over each other on. So that's kind of important. The other thing is to notice the epiphyseal line. This is also what's known as the growth plate or the growth line. And we'll spend more time talking about that when we go into, again, homeostasis and physiology. All right, periosteum and endosteum. Okay, periosteum and endosteum are basically the same substance, the same structure. It's a very dense connective tissue that is attached to the bone by way of those Sharpie's fibers or those perforating fibers. You can see them here. That's what literally holds it in. If you've ever eaten a rib or anything and you take that little covering on the rib and you rip it off, you're ripping off periosteum. Now, periosteum tells you outside, endosteum tells you inside. So the endosteum is what lines the cavity and the internal portion where you have that just that internal opening. All of the internal area is covered with an endosteum. The periosteum is just what's on the outside. The important part of the periosteum, the endosteum, is this is how blood vessels work their way in. This is how they're held in place. This is how they gain access to the actual interior and access to the tissue itself. Okay? Now, surface features. When we look at bone markings, no bone is smooth, no bone is flat. There are bumps and ridges and depressions and these dips in the bone. And the sole purpose of these bones is for sites of attachment for muscles, tendons, ligaments, and passages. So no bone is smooth because we have to be able to maximize space. It's sort of like what we talked about with the microvilli on the simple columnar tissue. You have to increase surface area to be able to attach everything to the bones that needs to be attached. Now, two basic categories. Projections and processes stick up. Depressions or cavities go down. So you can see there's common things. You will learn about the obturator meatus. You'll hear about the there are fissures, there are grooves, there are fascias. All of that tells you we're talking about a depression or an indentation. Tuberosities, tubercles, trochanters, crests, things that stick out. Now, when we look at the microscopic anatomy, again, this looks just like the compact bony tissue we've seen before, and we're going to go through a couple of things with it. So first and foremost, when we deal with it, this is typically what we think of as a Haversian system, this greater area right here. This is what's known as the Haversian system. Now, it has a central canal, okay, so this is the central canal, and we have perforating canals, and that's these major areas across between the central canals. So you can see those going across, and they have a specific function in terms of this is the major pathways. Think of this as major streets to allow arteries and veins to get access to the living tissue, because remember, bone is a living tissue. Now, lacunae and lamellae. Lacunae and lamellae are those holes. So when you look at the tissue, you can see, usually you can see that there's a dark little tissue, a dark little cell here. That space that it's in is what's known as the lacunae, okay? The layers, okay, the layers here, so you can see how I have a layer here and I have a layer here, that what makes it look like an onion, that's the lamellae. Okay, so those are the rings. That's the ring of tissue laid down. That's the compact tissue that's been laid down, and that's the lamellae. So it looks like an onion. Okay, so here you can see the lamellae, you can see the layers. Okay, you can see the canal. You can see how this was cut at an angle, and you can see the beginnings of that transverse canal. That's the perforating canals or the Volkmann's canals. Okay, you can see the osteocyte, which is the dark area here. Remember, those are living cells. You can see the central canals, and you can see the overall eversion system, or the osteon. Okay, now in addition, the canaliculi. Now the canaliculi are what look like these little cracks. See how it seems like I have these little cracks crossing the lamellae? Okay, those are the canaliculi. Okay, and these radiate from the central canal to each lacunae so that each osteocyte gets all the nutrition that it needs.